Buy more, buy all. I first met David Kripe at the Dayton Ham Radio Convention probably about 8 years ago or so. I needed some technical assistance from my nonprofit organization. We were working with really simple technologies, radio and lighting and that sort of thing. And a mutual friend said, I know your guy. It's David Kripe. And so I approached David, not knowing him at all, and said, here's what we're doing. Can you help? And I don't think it took him a tenth of a second to say yes, enthusiastically. And since then, he has helped us in so many ways. He created the little Humanilite kit that we were working on in a workshop the first day of Hope, actually. He's a tireless promoter of all things radio, and it's passionate about teaching kids that making stuff is more fun than consuming stuff. And professionally, he works in research and development, yes. Professionally, he works in research and development for military electronic systems, and he has more than 50 patents in his name. But more importantly, I always describe him as MacGyver. And that's the truth. When the apocalypse comes, he'll be quietly working away in his basement taking care of things while everybody else is screaming. So I'd like to welcome David Kripe.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This is my first Hope, and I am having a blast. I love the message. I love the many aspects here that are being drawn together, and the unified theme under all. I think the message that I'm going to bring is going to mesh very well with that and emphasize these themes. As Thomas mentioned, I'm a big promoter of amateur radio, and the reasons why will become clear in a bit. Throughout the weekend that we are sharing here, one of the aspects that we observe is that all of this technology can be quite fragile. All of this technology is based on one single commodity, and that is electricity. And should anything happen to that electricity, many things will fail in rapid succession. There's an inherent fragility to the many things that make our life possible and pleasurable. One key experience that kind of drove that home for me occurred almost exactly 25 years ago this week. It was summer of 1993. It was a very rainy summer, and over the 4th of July weekend, there was 6 inches of rain that fell on northern Iowa. And it became very apparent shortly thereafter that there was a big surge of water heading down all of the rivers towards where I lived in Quincy, Illinois. And the projections were that the river was going to crest the levees that protected our area by at least 4 feet. So things had to happen. And it was pointed out to the amateur radio group to which I belonged that the power substation was down in the river bottom. The telephone relay station was down in the river bottom. And the water pumping and purification system that provided water for the entire community was down in the cheap real estate in the river bottom. And if it got flooded, all of that would go away. So literally overnight, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Illinois Department of Transportation, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, all these organizations came together to start sandbagging and raise that levee. Within the Snai Island Drainage District, which that county was part of, there were over 300 miles of levees that had to be raised. Thousands of volunteers came forth, and it would have been utter chaos because there was no way to communicate and coordinate all of them except with a system that utilized no infrastructure, and that was amateur radio. So we had hundreds of volunteers with walkie-talkies riding with Red Cross trucks, Corps of Engineer trucks, in the police station, in the hospital, coordinating the communications that would not happen in the overloaded phone system. And for 2 weeks, we raised the sandbags, and it rained again, and we realized we would have to raise them again. We ended up raising the levee 8 feet. It was 1 inch above the level of the final crest of the river, and it held. The levee on the west side of the Mississippi River did not. It was breached. Ultimately, it was determined it was an act of sabotage, and the eastern counties of Missouri for 2 weeks became the 5th largest freshwater lake in North America. But that drove home the message that some of these things that we take for granted are very fragile, and we need to have plans in mind what we can do to strengthen them. Now, one of the areas of fragility, which I'm going to talk about today, actually manifested and became part of our awareness many, many years ago. And we begin with what is known as the Carrington event, which occurred August 1st, 1859. It was named after Richard Carrington, who was an astronomer in the Royal Observatory in England, who was looking through a device like this, a helioscope, monitoring the sunspots. And it projects an image of the sun on a screen, so you don't actually look at the bright rays. And as he was looking at the sun, he observed something that was had never been seen before at that time. He observed 2 brilliant white spots appearing on the surface of the sun. And this was so unusual that he left his post trying to find an assistant to drag over and show, hey, come here, there's 2 bright white spots on the sun. Well, the sun is already white. No, this is special, come over. And by the time he dragged his assistant over to look at the screen, they had faded. But he recorded in his journal what had occurred. The spots here labeled A and B were within an existing sunspot area and were brilliant white spots. And this was the very first observed solar flare. But associated with this solar flare was something, again, that it's something that had never been seen before. This was what we now know as a coronal mass ejection. The sun got violently sick. And is my GIF going to work? It's not. Okay. What happened was 18 hours after this ejection of 10 million tons of ionized hydrogen gas, it struck the Earth with the force of 10,000 nuclear bombs. This gas hit the magnetosphere and shifted the Earth's magnetic field, and it was first observed by telegraph operators. In their offices, they all of a sudden started noticing that the telegraph lines and their telegraph keys were starting to throw arcs and sparks, growing in size up to 6 inches. Fearing something terrible was happening, they disconnected their batteries and found out that they could still send messages even with the batteries disconnected. What was happening was the changes in the Earth's magnetic field was inducing, through an inductive field, currents in the telegraph lines. Violent currents with voltages capable of jumping these 6-inch sparks. Meanwhile, and there's no photographs to back this up, aurora borealis were being observed at places they had never been seen before, as far south as Cuba and Panama. There were gold miners in the Sierra Nevadas who woke in the middle of the night thinking that it was dawn because the sky was illuminated. And chickens started crowing and all this, but it was a brilliant pink glow to the sky, and nobody knew what it was. It wasn't until they correlated this with the brilliant solar flare that they kind of figured that the sun was involved with this phenomenon. This is a coronal mass ejection. There's another phenomenon that we want to talk about, and that is an EMP, or electromagnetic pulse. And the first observation of this was with a nuclear test called Starfish Prime. This occurred in July 9th, 1962. The reasoning for this test was the Van Allen belts had just been discovered a couple years earlier. These are belts of intense radiation that surround the Earth, and it was thought at that time they would be an impenetrable barrier to spaceflight. They would destroy any satellite or manned mission that would attempt to pass through it. The Starfish Prime nuclear test was a high-altitude hydrogen bomb explosion that was sought to get information on what would happen in a high-altitude explosion, and also possibly modify or weaponize the Van Allen belts. So this took place over the Central Pacific, nearby the Hawaiian Islands. And I have another animated GIF that's not going to work. Okay. But this is the actual photograph of that explosion at the moment it took place over Honolulu. You see Honolulu down below. What happened at that instant, though, was something not entirely appreciated at the time. The explosion of the atom bomb created a huge burst of gamma rays that descended down into the atmosphere, where it knocked loose electrons. And those electrons created an intense burst of radio frequency energy that then passed down into the Hawaiian Islands and basically anything within line of sight of that bomb. A lot of weird things happened that were not completely understood at the time. They had burglar alarms going off. Strings of streetlights went out instantaneously. There was a microwave telephone link that failed. And it wasn't until some years afterwards that the official explanation came out. A lot of the actual test information for this is still classified, interestingly enough. So even to this day, we don't know exactly the intensity of the fields that were measured at that point. In October of 1962, the Russians had to have their own high-altitude nuclear test. They launched a hydrogen bomb at a similar altitude over Kazakhstan, and they observed some different things. Now, bear in mind that Kazakhstan was very sparsely populated. There were no transistor circuits present there. It was all vacuum tube stuff. But the Kazakhs observed that in the aftermath of that atomic explosion, they had power transformers, power distribution transformers simply melting down. Power lines were melting and failing, catching on fire, and the main power supply to the Kazakh region caught on fire and burned down. This was something they did not expect, and it was very shocking. Now, historians, what happened in October of 1962? Cuban Missile Crisis. Immediately after this test, the Russians pulled their missiles out of Cuba. One can speculate whether the outcome of this test had something to do with that. Now, this is historically known. We can extrapolate what can happen in the future from what we know, but it is time for my disclaimer. There's a lot about these tests that we don't know. What we do know about the historic EMP tests is they occurred, and we can try to simulate those tests using EMP simulators to recreate the particular impulses that were measured with equipment that may not have been capable of fully capturing the effect. What happened in 1962 mostly occurred to vacuum tube electronics. The transistor electronics at the day were very simple, not a lot of it there. Much of the details are still classified. Much of the projected damage that is officially within the US government projections is not correlated by what happened over Kazakhstan. They saw much worse results, most likely because the Hawaiian island is very different geographically than the plains of Kazakhstan. So my disclaimer is there's just a lot about EMPs in particular that we do not know. I'm going to provide the best information that I've been able to glean from open source data. And if you choose to disagree with me, I'm not going to argue. There's room for disagreement. But again, I'm going to try to present the best information that I can. We can extrapolate from this information, try to project and predict what may happen should another EMP burst occur this over the continental United States. But in the end, there's a lot we don't know and cannot know. What we do know of EMP occurring from a high altitude nuclear burst is there are three spectral components. The first is called E1. That's the first component of the burst, and that's due to the high-powered gamma rays penetrating the atmosphere, knocking loose electrons. That is a 50,000 volt per meter pulse. Okay, point of reference. Inside your microwave oven, the electrical fields are only 1,000 volts per meter. And in a confined space, 50,000 volts per meter across thousands of miles. It is, however, a very brief pulse, only about 5 nanoseconds wide. So this means that it has a peak of its frequency component somewhere around the 500 megahertz range, perhaps. So that means that the resonant antenna is going to be something a foot or so in length. Following E1 is called the E2 burst. That is approximately 1 microsecond in length, about 100 times weaker in intensity, and very much mimics the effect of a nearby lightning strike. Now, who here has had lightning strike a tree near your house and you've lost your washing machine, your TV, your computer? Yeah, this is going to be the same thing that happens over a multi-hundred-mile area. Following that is what's called the E3 effect, and that is a massive disruption of the Earth's magnetic field. And that occurs due to the huge mass of ionized gases that are rising convectively after the nuclear blast. And those charged particles, in their motion, create a magnetic field that disrupts the Earth's field. That induces currents into long suspended wires, in particular power lines. This period occurs in a period of tens to hundreds of seconds, and then it's over. And this diagram shows the particular voltage, intensity, and time profile of what's likely to happen. Now, the damaging effects, again, are going to be related to the intensity and the wavelengths of these effects. E1 is going to affect short antennas, which are likely to be the power cords that plug into your appliances, internal wiring, perhaps, that may be of the appropriate length to pick up these signals. E2, again, as I mentioned, is similar to the effect of a nearby lightning strike. E3, this is interesting. Its effect is to create DC currents within power lines, which were designed to carry AC. When those currents enter transformers, it gives the opportunity for the transformer to saturate. Its open circuit inductance goes to 0. It overloads and can be destructive. There is a specific distribution of the effects that we can project from a high-altitude nuke. If you have something that is set off at, say, a 300-mile altitude over the upper Midwest, the distribution of the effect is actually in an arc primarily to the southern distribution, with peaks of 50,000 volts per meter, again in the red zone. But even throughout the light blue circle, you're going to see voltages of 25,000 volts per meter. So it could literally blanket the entire United States. Knowing what these pulses look like in terms of amplitude and frequency, we can build simulators that strive to duplicate these effects. And here we have the North American Electric Reliability Corporation has built their simulator. And what this is, you can see a bar across the top. That's a dipole antenna. It's excited from a Marx generator that is capable of delivering a 500,000 volt pulse into this roughly 10-meter long antenna. And items to be tested will be placed underneath that. So the question is, should an EMP occur, what is likely to survive? And the easy answer is things without a lot of transistors. A battery. A battery is big and dumb and chemical. Your car battery will survive, the little batteries in your smoke detector and transistor radio will survive, but the smart batteries in your computers and cell phones are not likely to survive because they include smart charging circuitry inside. What will survive an E1 pulse? A tube-type radio. This is the classic Hallicrafter's S38. Thomas, do you have one? Yeah. Very good. Okay. Tube-type equipment did not experience failures in the Hawaiian test because the vacuum tubes are macroelectronics, not microelectronics. They are large-scale devices that can absorb the energy. Okay. This is a very popular radio among preppers because it is a transformerless design. It can be operated from 120 volts DC. 10 car batteries strung together will run this. So, if you want to make some money, find one of these at a flea market, upgrade it, change the capacitors, put it on eBay as a prepper radio, you can make some money. Okay. In 2004, the EMP Commission studied 37 different cars, placed them in that simulator, hit them with the EMP pulse, the E1 pulse, and found to their amazement, all of them survived. Okay, I read this and I had such a cognitive dissonance, I could not understand that because everything that I've read up to that point says, oh, it's total disaster, nothing will survive, we're going to be going back to horse and buggy. But, okay, I've worked in the automotive engineering world for quite a few years. Automobiles are designed to withstand some absolutely horrific electrical conditions. An automobile and its electrical components must be designed to survive installing a battery backwards. Because the nuclear scientists are doing nuclear science and the other guys are working in auto mechanics. Inside every electrical component inside the car is a surge suppressor. It's a powerful Zener diode. It's about the size of a nickel. And the electrical spec for cars says that it must survive the application of a pulse of 120 volts for 400 microseconds. 400 milliseconds, excuse me. So those Zener diodes, which are distributed out through the entire car, have to sink that energy. And it will do a wonderful job for an E2 pulse, and evidently it does a pretty good job for an E1 pulse also. So At first glance, you would say that the advice of all the preparedness experts that you get a pre-1980s diesel vehicle that has no electronics in it, well, yeah, that's a good advice, but even afterwards, it may not be such a bad deal. Okay, my caveat, my disclaimer I have to throw in here. After 2004, cars have been manufactured with a whole lot more computer circuitry. Is that computer circuitry going to be more vulnerable than what was made in 2004? Odds are yes, but I can't tell you how much more because we've not had a test done since then. As it turns out, most ham equipment will survive. There were a series of tests done in 1985. Results were published in QST magazine, if you want to look that up, again by the EMP Commission. And you would think that this equipment has a lot of transistors in it, it's going to fail due to that pulse. And it turns out that none of it did. Again, the cognitive dissonance hits because we're told everything's going to die. This stuff did not. And the reason for that is this transceiver equipment here must generate about 100 watts. So it must not interfere with itself, so there's a protection circuit built in to keep it from destroying itself from its own internally generated electromagnetic fields. And that also gives it a degree of protection from external fields. And these radios, even with the antennas of their microphones plugged in, seem to survive. Now, my disclaimer, those radios had metal cabinets. These little walkie-talkies have plastic cases. The metal provides some protection that the plastic does not. My beloved little walkie-talkie might not survive, but I have plans for it. What will survive an E1 pulse? Strategic weapons. And they must, as we'll get into in a little bit. I've actually seen these planes up close, and the groovy thing is the windshield and the windows on it have a metal grid embedded in them just like the windows of a microwave oven. It keeps the stuff out because you want this flying when the bombs start going off. But what is vulnerable? From the EMP testing, we know that things with a lot of microelectronics have very small gates which are not capable of absorbing large amounts of energy. So for that, we know that likely your satellite receivers, smart meters, anything with a lot of microelectronics in it that is not specifically hardened for any type of industrial control, it's likely to go. Sorry. So ways to protect your vulnerable electronics. Number one, disconnect everything that's not in use. And that's good advice whether you're fearing that the North Koreans are going to launch a nuke or if you're in lightning season and you're sitting on top of a mountain. Unplug everything because the wiring of your house is a great antenna that's going to collect that energy and direct it into anything that's plugged in. My personal favorite strategy is to put a surge suppressor on everything that is plugged in that's electronics. So your computer, your microwave, your TV, all that expensive stuff, go down to Walmart, get a surge suppressor, it plugs into your outlet, and that will swallow most of the energy of a pulse that comes in your line. When lightning struck near my house in 2008, we lost 2 CFL light bulbs, and all the neighbors around us lost microwaves and ovens and washing machines and expensive stuff. Number 3, shield everything with a Faraday cage. Anything that is particularly sensitive, that you care about, or that cannot be protected in any of the other ways. Okay, a Faraday cage is not a cage for ferrets. And there's a lot of misconceptions and myths that go around about what makes an effective Faraday cage. A Faraday cage, simply stated, is a conductive sphere or body that surrounds your sensitive item. It's made of highly conductive material with some thickness to it, so it will conduct that pulse around your sensitive item so that the item in the center does not even know that a pulse has occurred. If you go into the prepper literature, they will tell you a lot of things. Yeah, they'll tell you, put your electronics in an ammo box. An ammo box is made of steel. Oh yeah, that's good, except it's not, because steel is a very poor conductor of electricity. You get just about as much good by digging a hole and burying your item. Not that I would recommend that either. Additionally, the steel box has a lid that just folds down on top and does not create a metal-to-metal contact, so that gap is wide open for these frequencies to penetrate. Okay, I'm getting a headache here. One of the other prepper sites says, well, if you see the blast, just throw your radio into the microwave and slam the door. If you can do that within 5 nanoseconds, you're pretty good. Yeah, a microwave oven is intended to shield the microwave's inside from getting out, and vice versa. It's better than nothing, but you can do better. And the other one, which really gets me, is the so-called EMP bags. And they're sold on the same websites that sell the nutritional supplements that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, if you buy parts from DigiKey, they come in these bags. It's kind of a silvery colored plastic, and you can see through them. And in my reasoning, if you can see through them, that the metallization is not really too adequate. And there's empirical tests where you put your cell phone in here and dial it, and it may not pick up. But there's also some actual tests, which we'll get into in a second. Science experiment here. Okay, we talk about decibels or dB. That's a measure of attenuation. 10 dB means that you're cutting things by a factor of 10, taking out 90% of the signal. 20 dB is 100-fold. 30 dB is 1,000-fold. So when we're talking about how much shielding you get, we're going to talk about dB. Your file cabinet and ammo box gives you less than 10 dB of attenuation. Now, these are verified by some experiments by a NASA scientist, Dr. Arthur Bradley, who has actually gone with calibrated equipment, not a cell phone experiment, calibrated equipment to measure the attenuation at the frequencies of choice. The EMP bag is only good for about 15 dB. A galvanized trash can gives you 20 dB. So that's taking out 99% of the impulse. But I just said that steel is not a good material for a Faraday shield. It's not the steel of the trash can that's working here, it's the zinc coating that's actually a pretty decent conductor. If you wrap the lid with aluminum duct tape, the metal tape that you can get at the hardware store, you double the effectiveness, which tells you that the gap around the lid leaks a whole lot of energy in that you can very effectively knock down. A microwave oven is good for 25 to 40 dB, but the simplest and easiest one, you get a sheet of aluminum foil, you take it out of your hat, take your sensitive item, fold it over, wrap it up like you're making a sandwich that you want to keep really fresh, crimp over those edges just as tight as you can, and that right there is good for 50 dB of attenuation. How much do you need? And that's something that nobody ever says. Okay, I'm going to stick my neck out here, and I will be the first person to ever say so, but I'm going to define that you need 60 decibels of attenuation of that 50 kilovolt signal to be safe in just about every condition you can. So you take your folded aluminum foil wrap, you stick it in another plastic bag and wrap it around with aluminum foil again. You've now got 100 dB of attenuation, and nothing's getting through that. Personally, what do I keep in a Faraday cage? It's things that are absolutely essential and not easily obtainable. I have another walkie-talkie just like that, wrapped in aluminum foil. I have a 40-meter CW ham radio transceiver. If the communication infrastructure goes down, this will still allow me to send long-haul signals over thousands of miles to handle emergency messages. Things like this were used in the aftermath of Katrina for months until they got the telephone infrastructure back up. A multi-band radio, you're going to need information. There will be broadcasters that survive an incident like this. Where they get their information from is another question, but you will need that information, and whether it's AM, FM, or any of the shortwave bands, there will be something there that you can listen to and something of use. Okay, this one, and there are chuckles, and the presentation last night about putting Linux on one of these e-readers was really good. Ideally, I would love to have a tablet that is mil-spec and ruggedized, but the old Barnes & Noble Nook, it's in a rubberized case. I can drop it and it's going to survive. And the cool thing is, it will have multiple months of battery life because there's no backlight to suck the battery. I've got a 16 gig card in here with 6,000 books and documents in here. Manuals for every vehicle I own, every appliance I own, every piece of ham radio equipment that I own, books on medicine, surgery, metallurgy, welding, woodworking. It's all on archive.org. Just go out there, spend a couple of days downloading the information that will be essential in the event that the internet does not exist tomorrow, or you can't make a trip down to the library because people are burning books for heat. A multimeter, because I'm going to be fixing all the stuff that I couldn't fit in the Faraday cage. Okay, I do not have one of these, but the vulnerable part of your car will be the engine computer. It's already pretty well shielded, but again, it's the vulnerable part, and it makes the difference between your car being a usable vehicle for getting around or a $10,000 garden ornament. Get one of these, wrap it in foil, and you're good. Go to the junkyard, they're cheap. Now then, for an E3 pulse, the E3 pulse would be the consequence of either CME or the E3 from a EMP. That induces the very high voltages and the DC currents, which will burn out the transformers. In 2003, there was a small CME that mostly affected the upper altitudes of Canada. This is actual pictures of one of the high-power distribution transformers that was burned out from the onset of the CME and the disruption in the magnetosphere to the damage and failure of this transformer was 90 seconds. So there's not a lot of time to react to that if you're even aware that it's happening. This has been analyzed and the effects projected. For a CME of half a microtesla per minute of magnetic flux change, which is corresponding to the damage that occurred in the 1921 CME, which is only about half the strength of what happened in the Carrington event. Okay, these green dots are where geomagnetic current exits the ground. Red is where it enters back into the ground. So anytime you see one of these circles, you will have a circuit breaker blowing. These two elements here in circles, left and right side, that represents areas where transformers will fail and there will be long-term power outages. If there is an EMP blast over Chicago based on these projected field strengths, this is the damage, and you have nationwide grid down. In such a case, you are going to see something on the order of 350 high voltage transformers destroyed, $1 to $2 trillion of economic damage the first year, and up to 10 years to restore. The problem is these transformers take about a year to build. There are very few places in the United States that make them. Most of them are made in Europe and shipped over. So that's an issue. You cannot replace 350 of them all at one time. As it exists, the grid is operating at about 90% capacity. It's more efficient that way. If you lose 10% of your transformer capacity, everything goes down. Beyond that, you're talking global or national blackout conditions. The fragility of the grid is one thing, but its interdependency on all of the other essential services, you have to stop and pause and reflect on that, because you have effects on the oil and gas industry. All these pipelines are pumped. Without power to pump them, you lose gas and oil. Communications, internet, cell phones, landlines, all of those operate on the grid. They have battery backups which last for perhaps 36 hours if you're lucky. The really good ones have gen sets and diesel storage that can run for a couple of weeks. Past that point, they go down. Water that is being pumped, without the pumping stations that run on the grid, that goes down. You have no water to drink. You have no water to flush the toilet. Banking and finance, your credit card goes non-functional. I don't have any cash in my pocket. Doggone it. That's a problem. Transportation, if for example, we have multiple vehicle failures, say in the tunnels here, we are now locked in, cannot escape the island. Emergency services are similarly affected. They are vitally dependent upon communication. And the government services, FEMA and so on, which would be providing emergency services, cannot communicate, cannot be transported. Basically, any grocery store has about 3 days worth of inventory. And when that's gone, stomachs start rumbling. Worst case scenario is if you have an E3 event that sends a surge back up into a nuclear power plant. You can shut down a nuclear power plant and its core remains hot for several weeks. And unless there are water pumps that continuously cool that, it melts down. That's what happened in Fukushima. There are generators on site with diesel fuel to operate these pumps, every installation. Enough fuel to keep it running. If those gen sets and pumps are affected by either an E1 or an E3 pulse, bad things happen. And you've got nuclear power plants all over. Use of EMP in warfare, yeah. We know who the bad guys are. Most likely it's the little loudmouths like North Korea and Iran. Trouble is, though, it's very hard to do an EMP anonymously. You can follow the missiles with the radar back to their point of origin. The concept of mutually assured destruction has been very effective, even though kind of scary for the past several generations. But you know what? It's difficult to predict the psychology of other entities. You can project something like a school shooter who acts in a very irrational manner to take out as many other people as he wants, knowing that his ultimate goal is suicide. Project from there to a much larger gun. But the saving grace in my mind is that nuclear weapons are extremely expensive, and so are the delivery systems. And those people most likely to use it are the ones least likely to afford it. But with the knowledge of the vulnerability of the grid comes another threat. It takes a guy with a high-powered rifle on a hillside 3 or 4 shots to put a hole in one of these high-voltage transformers. The oil drains out, it overloads, it overheats, and it's gone. This happened in California in 2014, and nobody was ever caught. And it has all the hallmarks of a deliberate act as a rehearsal. Okay, 9/11 was 19 guys with flight lessons in airplanes. You find 100 unhappy people with high-powered rifles, and they could do as much damage as a high-altitude EMP for 1/1000th of the budget. Yeah. 4 minutes. Okay.
That could be used as Q&A audience, or you can take questions later, actually.
Okay. What is being done to protect us? The 2015 transportation bill had $17 million set aside for an EMP study to identify transformers in inventory that can be moved and to set aside a strategic transformer pool of transformers that can be bought, put in place, ready to be shipped around the country at a moment's notice. So it's not totally hopeless. For us to survive, make some plans. Can you, for this, my everyday carry is my MacGyver pocket knife. It's super handy because the good beer does not come in twist-off tops. You need to be able to, at the very least, provide for warmth, use one of these Mylar space blankets, be able to open a can, be able to purify water, get information and communication like my little Nook, my little walkie-talkie. That is essential. Essential reading, 1 Second After by William Fortune is a piece of fiction, but it's very accurate and well-researched. A couple of other authors, Fernando Aguirre, Selko Begovic. These 2 gentlemen were in Argentina and Yugoslavia, respectively, during the unpleasantness there, and they have seen the effects of disruption of systems and the effect on people who suddenly find themselves going into third world existence and hunger. One of my key formative experiences was in 2003 when Hurricane Isabel hit Williamsburg, Virginia, when I was living there. It was a Cat 5 storm when it hit the Outer Banks, and by the time it rolled through, there were millions of trees down. We had just moved into this cul-de-sac, and when the storm blew over and the sun came out, we all stepped out to survey the damage. There was no phone, there was no power, and there would not be for weeks. And we looked up and down the street, and there were people that we had never met before. That's the reality of suburban life, but we were now meeting these neighbors and realizing we've got refrigerators full of food that's going to go bad. So we rolled the gas grills out of our garages and fired them up and started cooking first the frozen pizzas as they thawed, then the hamburgers, then the roasts, then the hams, and then the turkeys, and we had a week-long block party. And in the process, we made friends, lifelong friends that we never would have otherwise. And I think that is kind of a microcosm lesson of how we need to be facing this, because it didn't matter if the guy down the street had a rainbow flag and the other guy had a Confederate flag. All those flags blew away in the wind. And even though worst case projections will be that bad things can happen and millions of people will die, millions of people will not. Be one of the ones who will not, and you'll have an opportunity to rebuild your community and make it a better place. Thank you. Do we have have time for questions?
Outside, in the elevator lobby area.
Fair enough, thanks.
Thank you, David. And so, yeah, if you didn't hear that, if you've got questions for David, you can have them outside just